How's it going, everyone? I hope you're having a great day. Welcome to another episode of the Principles of Baking. In today's video, we'll talk about soakers, what they are and how to use them in bread making. So let's go to the kitchen and have a closer look. A soaker is a mix of grains and seeds that is combined with water and left to hydrate for up to several hours before being added to bread dough. It is a great method for adding whole grains and seeds to your bread dough, making it more tasty and nutritious. It also helps the bread retain more water, making it stay fresher for longer. And the best part is that you can use pretty much any grains and seeds that you like. If you can use it in cooking, then you can definitely use it in bread making. The main reason for soaking the grains and seeds is to make them palatable. Just imagine biting down on a piece of raw barley. You definitely need to go to see your dentist right away. Another reason for soaking grains and seeds is to prevent them from stealing the water from your bread dough. I'm sure that we all, one time or another, have added a bunch of seeds to our bread dough, only to find that the dough has become dry and tough. You can also use pulses like lentils and beans, but those actually need to be cooked instead of just soaked. Here on my table is just the stuff that I found in my cupboard. On the far left, we got brown linseeds. Then on the top row, we got sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, pine nuts, which are seeds, they're not nuts. Then we got poppy seeds, and on the far right, we have black sesame seeds. The middle and the bottom row consists of grains. We have cornmeal and oats, then wild rice, barley, toasted buckwheat and millet. Toasted buckwheat is my favorite grain of all time, by the way. I eat this stuff pretty much every day. Buckwheat for Eastern Europeans is what rice is for Asians and South Americans. And all of this is just a tiny selection of all the grains and seeds out there. I'm sure you could look around in your cupboard right now and find something that you don't see on my table. And I would encourage you to try out some more unusual options. Let's look at the two types of soakers. The first type is a cold soaker, meaning that it's made with cold or ambient temperature water. This kind of soaker would normally consist of softer grains and seeds. Anything that doesn't require a lot of cooking basically. That will be your oats, cornmeal, and pretty much any kind of seed, because they can easily be eaten raw. Cold soakers can take as little as 30 minutes to prepare, but they can be left to soak for several hours. To prepare a cold soaker, simply grab your scales, choose which grains and seeds you would like to use, weigh them out, and then mix with water. I would normally add up to 20% grains and seeds to my bread dough. So for a 500 gram flour loaf, I would add 100 grams of grains and seeds. You can of course go higher. Now quick note on salt. Now especially when making a hot soaker, which we'll move on to in a minute, or even when making a cold soaker in a hot kitchen or in a hot climate, it is advisable to add a little bit of salt. It will slow down enzymatic activity and prevent it from developing off flavors. Around 2% in relation to the seed and grain mix should be sufficient. Now speaking of percentages of salt and water, it is important to account for the soaker absorbing quite a lot of it. Normally we would calculate the amount of water and salt in a recipe in relation to the total amount of flour, but when using a soaker, you must calculate the amount of salt and water in relation to the total amount of flour plus the grains and seeds. Only then you will get to a correct hydration and balance of flavor. And that's our cold soaker done. It can be left at room temperature or it can be refrigerated. Now let's move on to the hot soaker. This is made with hard, whole or cracked grains, like the wild rice, toasted buckwheat, millet and barley. This kind of soaker is made with boiling water, but the exact same method applies. Grab your scales, weigh your grains and add water. You should always make the mix with more water than grains, ideally at a 1 to 1.5 ratio, but you could definitely add even more. These grains soak up water surprisingly well, as you'll see later on. And as I mentioned earlier, when using boiling water or hot water, it's always advisable to add a little bit of salt to your soaker. Now I'm not going to this time, because I'm letting this cool down to room temperature and then refrigerating it. Because the soaker makes up a significant part of our bread dough, it will greatly affect the final dough temperature after mixing. And using a cold soaker can help you with controlling that temperature, but you should always leave your soaker to cool down to room temperature before refrigerating it. And that is how you make a hot soaker. Let's leave it to hydrate and let's see what we get. So it's been around 24 hours, and look at the difference. There is no liquid left in the bowl. It has all been absorbed by the grains and the seeds in both the cold and hot soakers. I could have added even more water to this. But saying that, everything's hydrated correctly, and both of these can now be added to dough. A soaker can be added to the bread dough right from the beginning of the mix, but it can also be added later on, after some gluten development. I prefer to add it at the beginning, because that way I instantly know what the consistency of my dough will be, and if I ever need to adjust the hydration or not. By the way, soakers made with seeds can sometimes become a little bit gloopy and gooey, but that is completely normal, so don't be afraid when you see this. There's nothing wrong with it. And that's about it when it comes to soakers. It's an extremely simple method. But to show you a real life example, I thought I should include a recipe. So here's what we got. Some whole wheat flour, white flour, whole rye flour, yeast, salt, malt syrup, water, barley, buckwheat, brown linseeds and millet. And to further enhance this bread, we'll also use a pre-ferment in this recipe. And this is of course going to use a hot soaker method, because we got hard grains like barley, buckwheat and millet. The linseeds on the other hand are not hard, but they are part of the soaker, so they'll be going along for the ride. And this time I will be adding 2% of salt to the soaker, so I have to deduct that from the total amount of salt in the recipe. And I'm going to be adding more than double the amount of water, so there's 90 grams of grains and seeds and 200 grams of water, and we'll see how much gets absorbed. Be sure to give your soaker a good mix, just to dissolve the salt and make sure that everything's hydrated, and cover it well to not let the water evaporate, because losing water will lower the hydration of our dough. I will leave this to cool down to room temperature and then refrigerate it, and I do this to control the final dough temperature. Now at the same time as the soaker, we can make the pre-ferment. It consists of part of the water, a tiny pinch of yeast, the whole rye flour and some of the whole wheat flour. Now if your kitchen is really hot, some salt can be added to the pre-ferment too, and I explain this in detail in my salt episode. You can find that in the Principles of Baking playlist on my channel. Make sure to mix your pre-ferment well so there's no dry flour left. Then cover it and ferment it for up to 16 hours. My one took around 12 hours. Now if your pre-ferment has risen, but you're not ready to make your bread yet, you can also refrigerate it to slow it down. You can use it up to 12 hours later, but keep in mind temperature control. A cold pre-ferment, a cold soaker, will make a cold dough. So if you're gonna refrigerate the pre-ferment, at least pull the soaker out to come up to room temperature. But I didn't have to do it this time. And this looks ready to go, so let's move on to making our dough. And just look how much liquid the grains and seeds have absorbed. There's pretty much nothing left. So let's continue. In a large bowl, combine your soaker, add the yeast, the salt and the syrup, and give everything a good mix. Just dissolve the salt and hydrate the yeast. I like to distribute the ingredients evenly before adding the bulk of the flour. You can also add the pre-ferment at this point, which I forgot to be honest, but never mind. Follow the mix with the remaining ingredients, the white flour and the whole wheat flour, and the pre-ferment if you're me. Then grab your dough scraper and mix everything until there's no more dry flour left. And if the scraper's not doing the job, continue on by hand. And once everything's mixed well, tip the dough out on the table and we can start kneading it. It's a relatively low hydration dough, so it only takes about 3 minutes of kneading, especially because we are going to be baking this in a tin. Some of the barley and millet grains may be popping out and scattering around on your table. Simply knead them back into the dough. And this is what it should look like after mixing. It's quite a solid piece of dough, but it should still be soft. Let's pop it in a bowl and take its temperature. Around 23 degrees Celsius, just about right for this. That's around 73 degrees Fahrenheit. Because of the high percentage of whole wheat flour and the use of a pre-ferment, this dough is quite active. So even at such a low temperature, just 2 hours of bulk fermentation is sufficient. If your kitchen is cooler, it may take longer. If it's warmer, it may take less time. Once your dough is double in size, you're ready to go. And to not complicate this recipe any further, I skip the fold during bulk fermentation, and after fermenting, we go right to final shaping. Place the dough out on the table with the smooth side down, fold the two sides towards the middle, and then starting from the top, roll it up gently. It doesn't have to be extremely tight. The most important part is to make it nice and even and straight. If you're gonna do this as a freestanding loaf, you can pinch the seam together just in case. And simply leave it to ferment with the seam side down on a baking tray, and then bake it that way. You can also place it in a bread basket with the seam side up, and then invert it on a hot pan and cover it and bake it that way. I chose the tin, because it's the simplest option. Now here's a neat trick I've been using lately. Now you can do this with pretty much any dough. If the surface of it is a little bit dry, you might want to wet it with water. It's just a baking tray full of seeds. Gently roll the loaf across it to cover the whole surface. And of course don't forget the sides. This is an awesome way of adding even more seeds to your bread. And it will pretty much guarantee that the dough doesn't stick to the tin. And of course it won't stick to a bread basket if you decide to use that. This is a 1 kilo or 2 pound loaf tin that I'm using here. Be sure to place the dough in with the right side up. It's quite easy to lose the seam once it's covered with seeds. Press the dough down gently to fit the shape of the tin. And that's it, we can cover it up and leave it for the final proof. And this will depend on the temperature of your kitchen. It took me around an hour and a half. Be sure to preheat your oven during the final hour of fermentation. 220 degrees Celsius or 430 Fahrenheit. Fan off. And once your loaf is nicely puffed up like this, it's ready for the oven. But if yours needs longer, then leave it for longer. Or if it's fermenting rapidly, then bake it sooner. The fermentation times in any bread recipe are just guidelines. They mostly apply to my kitchen specifically. Baking time, on the other hand, is pretty much universal. Around 35 minutes will do. Don't expect this kind of loaf to rise much. It already gains most of its volume during fermentation. Just look at that. Isn't it beautiful? So simple, yet effective. And if you go through some of my latest videos, you'll see a few recipes using soakers. Trust me, you try any of them, you won't be disappointed. And using the information I give in the videos in the Principles of Baking and Steps of Baking playlists, you'll be able to create your own recipes. And it's so easy and rewarding. I wrote this recipe in about 5 minutes, and I ended up with a unique and tasty bread, which I can bake again and again. And I can modify it, change the hydration, change the grains and seeds used. The possibilities are really endless, and I really encourage you to experiment, not just to follow recipes. Use the recipes as guidelines, and use the principles you've learned to make them your own. Understanding the principles of baking is far more valuable than knowing a recipe. It takes your bread making skills to the next level. So what do you think this method? Do you use soakers in bread making? What kind of grains and seeds do you like to add into them? Let me know down in the comments. See more videos like this one? Click right here. Subscribe to the channel? Click over here. That's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.